On my podcast, Under the Skin, available from Luminary, I spoke to Iain McGilchrist. He wrote the famous book, The Master and His Emissary. You might know him from seeing him on Jordan Peterson's podcast. He's a fantastic contributor, a brilliant author, a fantastic psychiatrist. In this conversation, we talk about the relationship between the left brain and the right brain and how our reality is configured as a result of the relationship between these two quite distinct neural hemispheres, how our mythology, our politics, our social systems are all constructed as a result of this relationship, or how there are subtle reflections of the, the anomalies in this relationship present in our society. His new book, The Matter with Things, is coming out. The link is in the description. Tell me what you think of this conversation.
Yes, perhaps I could just take a little time to unpack that thing about the right and left hemisphere difference without going into masses of detail. Effectively, because the left hemisphere pays very narrow beam attention to a detail that has taken its interest, and because the right hemisphere, meanwhile, is sustaining the whole picture, is vigilant and open, you get two kinds of pictures of the world. From the very narrow beam one that is flitting from this detail to that detail to the other, you get a vision of the world in which what it finds are a lot of disconnected fragments, atomistic, decontextualized, that may be put into categories in an attempt to understand them, or perhaps we try and put them together to make meaning out of them. They're rather abstract, and they're really more or less like symbols of real experience. They're kind of very pale imitations, if I may put it that way, of what you call animalistic, embodied experience is, which is the great thing we have while we're alive, is we have this rich way of sort of understanding reality through not just a mental scheme, but through our whole embodied existence. Emotions, intellect, and spirit together with the body. So you get that picture in the left hemisphere, and in the right hemisphere, you get a completely different picture, which is that nothing ultimately can be disconnected from anything. Everything is connected, which doesn't mean to say that it all collapses into one big mush. It's much more connected to the things immediately in the context of it. So, we're connected with one another because we're talking right now, and this room is very connected to me, but further out and beyond, everything connects. And what's more, all those things are constantly changing. They can't be pinned down for certain because they just can't be fixed and made. If they were dead, if you could stick a pin in it, as the left hemisphere would like, it takes a sort of snapshot. There, I've got it. And the right hemisphere says, no, sorry, it's already changed. So the right hemisphere has a vision of the world in which things get to be known constantly. They're coming into being and they're coming into being known. They're not fixed and dead certain aspects of the world like the left hemisphere makes them, like they're just counters in the game of knowledge. And the right hemisphere sees that everything is actually unique. I mean, it's a good shorthand to say, a table is a table, but actually every table is different. Every human being is different. And so there is nothing in which we are actually completely equal to one another. We're all quite different, which is great. At the same time, we have commonalities, we're all human beings, which is another good thing. So it's finding a way between a picture of the world, which is rich with meaning, understands implicit meaning, all those things that are implicit are understood by the right hemisphere. If it's not explicit, the left hemisphere tends not to get it. So it doesn't get jokes, really. It doesn't get poems, really. It doesn't get music, really. The right hemisphere is much better at all that stuff that gives richness and meaning to life. So you've got two distinct visions of the world there. But what I try to get away from is the idea that the right hemisphere is the only good one, and that somehow we ought to get rid of the left hemisphere, because the left hemisphere tells us something. It tells us something quite important, which needs to be combined with what the right hemisphere tells us, but not in an equal way, because the right hemisphere sees more. In my Master and His Emissary, the title of the 2009 book, the right hemisphere is the master and must be the master of the left. The left hemisphere, though, wants to be the master. It wants to dethrone the master. And it thinks it knows more. And that is simply because it knows less. I mean, the less it knows, the more it thinks it knows everything. The right hemisphere doesn't think it knows everything. It's aware of the need for what the left hemisphere tells it. In the story of the master and his emissary, the master appoints his emissary. So evolutionarily, the right hemisphere has said to the left hemisphere, you go and do this kind of work for us. It'll help very much. Create a map of things. It will be very good for strategic things, being able to grab stuff, grab food, grab territory, get one over on other people. And meanwhile, the right hemisphere has been holding the thing together and saying, this is the world, understand it now. So it helps us understand, and the left hemisphere helps us manipulate in a different way. Just like a map doesn't contain all the meaning that's in the world that is mapped. So I am reaching somewhere, I think. What I think we need is the divisional tendency of the left hemisphere and the unifying tendency of the right hemisphere to be unified. In other words, we need something that differentiates and something that brings back to a whole, but we need both of them to be together whole. So we don't want, an either or, which is what the left hemisphere goes for. And we don't need only a both and, as the right hemisphere goes for. We need both an either or and a both and.
Cool. I thought of some things.
Yes.
These are them. I thought about Moses and Aaron in the Old Testament, like the prophet necessarily has to be diaphanous and porous to receive to access the unknowable. And there needs to be a pragmatist. I thought of the sort of in a sort of Joseph Campbell type way, the sort of common pairing of the warrior and the priest. That we need a shaman, but we need Arjuna for Krishna, say. I thought about the necessity and the sort of speaking somewhat literally, that the necessity for subjugation that in the name of Islam, that if the left brain is not subjugated, if the mechanistic materialistic mentality takes over,
exactly,
false idols will rise. I thought of the necessity for a kind of a sort of a porousness between these two spaces, and in Jung, integrity and integration, like the idea of like integration with the shadow, like for completion in Jung's ideas, that the unconscious material needs to be incorporated to be whole. And I heard in what you were saying from your own area of expertise, the sort of the movements of other disciplines. I could hear the tunes of other descriptions of, according to what you said earlier, a kind of potentially a sort of a common reality. So, like, I suppose what you're saying is that in spite of potentially limitless difference and limitless variation, and perhaps our overly assertive inclination for taxonomy and the associated prejudices that might create, or at least opposition that could create, that there is an obvious requirement for, plainly evolved from our need to survive, for the sort of mechanistic interpretation of reality. But that possibly when people say, patriarchy and stuff, what they perhaps possibly what could be meant is that the dominion, the biases of this dominion have excluded the mystery. And I wouldn't approach it from a gender perspective anyway, because that's just, I guess it's not my experience, but I would approach it from a kind of that we have desacralized the world. We've that when we revere nature and acknowledge that there's something sort of unknowable, that we can somehow, that we are haunted by something in nature that we can never fully own, as you said, cannot fully be pinned down, that it creates reverence, and that we have a numinous experience of reality, as opposed to a sort of a mechanistic resource-based, this is here for us to use, smash that mountain down, we could use that for, like.
Yes, yes.
Well, if you enjoyed that conversation, please let me know what you thought of it in the comments below. Give it a little like, pass it around, share it about. If you really enjoyed it, go and subscribe to Luminary. You can get it on Apple Podcasts. Remember, Iain McGilchrist's new book, The Matter with Things, is available. The link in the description for that book is available now. If you really enjoyed this conversation, have a little look at this conversation. Very, very similar stuff. And if you need to meditate now, go to my side channel, Awakening. You should sign up to my mailing list, russellbrand.com as well, so we can stay in community together. Get connected. Thank you.